I tend to think that in Trump's time, you're going to see, instead of wars breaking out, we're going to be moving the other way. So I view that as, not necessarily a big positive for the markets because of other things going on, but I just don't think we're going to have things exacerbated by, you know, escalation. I just don't think that's likely. Down the road, I'm really looking at the next few years, but down the road, certainly, as I don't think we need war to get to my 25% inflation, but I do think, we're still in a world that's very unstable, and China's not going to go quietly into the night. If they see we're going to be doing a lot of reshoring, there's going to be a lot of tariff battles out there.
I want to get your take on Bitcoin. How do you see the current Bitcoin price action playing out? Are we, in your estimation, are we close to a top? Have we hit a top already? What do you see with Bitcoin?
Yeah, I pretty much beg off because I don't follow it. I've made the choice long ago, and it wasn't a case of not seeing potential. It had nothing to do with that or what I've said, and people take offense to it. But it really does not, to this point, have macro significance. It may, down the road, and certainly if Trump has his way, it might. But I see it as, it could be a good investment, just like uranium could be a good investment, or platinum could be a good. There are lots of things I don't follow that I just say it's not. It doesn't. I don't need it to make my macro forecast, so I just don't follow it. Um, the only comment I'll make, and it's, I tell people take it with a grain of salt because I truly, it's not a market I should be looked at as having any knowledge in because I don't follow it. But the only thing that troubles me, one thing that troubles me in it, is kind of the hype nature of it. The speculative type investing that surrounds it. Right now is certainly, the ultimate FOMO investment. And anybody that wants to tell me that it's up here on fundamentals, it's up here simply because momentum begets momentum, and you had a great run, and certainly you've had a few things happen in the last year. You had SEC approval for these funds, so there was demand coming from crypto funds that didn't exist before, so you had that. Um, and you've had, in more recent times, you've had Trump really get on board and select people that he wants that seemingly are on board. So there's lots of speculation there that demand's going to only go up from here, and they might be right. I don't know, but I am troubled. Certainly, I would be nervous if I were invested in crypto right now, or Bitcoin right now. I'd be nervous about the steepness of the recent slope. Not even talking about long term fundamentals or long term outlook, but just when something moves up that steeply, usually it has to step back. And usually the step back is you know pretty steep and fast.
Right. How do you account for geopolitical risk into your forecast, given that, I mean, we do have a major war in Europe, we have major wars in breaking out in the Middle East. How do you kind of figure those into your forecast?
Yeah, they're not really. I guess they're built in from the standpoint of my take right now is that the markets have had plenty of time to discount Ukraine. Not that it can't escalate into a nuclear war or something else. I think that's unlikely. I mean, maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I think it's unlikely. And particularly with Trump coming in, I think it's more likely we get some sort of a de-escalation there. It doesn't look like it immediately, but I think that's where it's going. You had an administration that really, seemed to promote the war or help contribute to the escalation. And the new administration is quite the opposite. So I think you're going to see something there, whether it's a total ceasefire and settlement or what, I'm not sure. But I think you're going to see de-escalation of Ukraine, of the Russia Ukraine. I tend to think that in Trump's time, you're going to see instead of wars breaking out, we're going to be moving the other way. So I view that as, not necessarily a big positive for the markets because of other things going on, but I just don't think we're going to have things exacerbated by, escalation. I just don't think that's likely.
Right. I mean, I asked the question because wars are inherently inflationary, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, down the road, I'm really looking at the next few years, but down the road, certainly, as I don't think we need war to get to my 25% inflation, but I do think we're still in a world that's very unstable, and China's not going to go quietly into the night if they see we're going to be doing a lot of reshoring. There's going to be a lot of tariff battles out there, and Europe's going to be struggling, I think, economically. So there's a lot of things that can happen as we go towards the end of the decade and into the early next decade. And by the way, the implications of an inflation rate that goes to the high double digits and interest rates go to high double digits, given the debt that's in the system, particularly given our the sovereign debt that's out there, and just looking at the U.S., how do you service right now? Let's say we have 35 trillion in just government debt, and a lot more than that when you take in all the liabilities. And it's going to go. I mean, I've said the 320 global debt is probably going to grow to 450 or 500 by the end of the decade, mostly because of the response to the bust. How do we, if we can barely service our debt at 5%, how do we service it at 15%? We can't. There's no equation that works. So I think we are moving, and again, we're not the only one. This is all around the world, same problems. I think we are moving towards a collapse sometime in the 2030s because I just don't see how we get through this.
what kind of collapse?
Well, I think it's a systemic collapse of the financial system you and I have known through our lifetimes. In other words, I think I've said this before in interviews, not to be dramatic, but I could possibly see a scenario where in the U.S. you have 50% plus unemployment, a government that's bankrupt, no access to capital because of what happened in the inflation, and we couldn't service all our debt. So who's going to want to buy our debt? So no access to new capital, which means no welfare system to speak of, no unemployment to speak of, limited or no Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, basically a free for all. I hate to say that that's where we're headed, but I think the numbers say this has been building for 80 years. Basically we're at the end of a super cycle that I define as the long cycle between two depressions. 1930s being the last depression, the 2030s being the next depression. And I think we're at the end of that when all those excesses that have built up over many cycles and many decades come crashing down. And, I don't know what comes out of the ashes of that. It's could be totalitarian. It could be, I know the hope would be that we could start fresh. You eliminate the debt and you start over and you learn from your mistakes. The likelihood is it's going to be a lot messier than that.
How do you see the tariffs impacting the U.S. economy?
Obviously, it's going to be tricky. I think the mistake that's being made, and it was part of what I think drove interest rates to where they are. Not this last move was more Fed reaction, but the earlier move from 360 back up over 4, to 4.25. A lot of that was based on fears of Trump policies and particularly tariffs. And you kept hearing out there how tariffs are inflationary. That if you put those tariffs in, they're maybe immediately inflationary because they add to price levels, They get passed along in groceries, etc., and product. But what happens is consumers have to cut back unless you're monetizing it. Consumers have to cut back, and ultimately it becomes, if anything, deflationary, or it certainly goes back towards neutral. But I'm of the belief that most of those tariffs are negotiating things. Some of them will stick, but a lot of the worst case scenario about his tariffs, and we know him well enough by now that he uses these. He means them. They're not just thrown out there and then he backs down. He will, if you don't negotiate with him, we'll see those tariffs. But I think most of the parties will come to the table, and we'll see much less onerous situation once it all gets worked out. But rightfully so, I think tariffs are necessary as a bargaining chip, if not more than that, because we gave away the store. I mean, for a long period of time, this globalist policy and the trade policies we had, we basically gutted our industry. We gutted our cities. A lot of our, and we have a lot bigger drug problem because of that. So I think he's truly. I mean, he and JD both are coming in with a sincere populist approach, saying we've got to restore the middle America. For too long it's been the financiers at the top, and the guys at the bottom are suffering, and the middle class is shrinking. And I think you're going to see big changes that way. That's, again, I would be very bullish that that's what's happening, if not for the macro. I just think they're almost coming in too late. We'll see. Maybe he can save it.